Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to be talking about terms that we use to identify politicians and people who are involved in discussing climate change and are involved in the climate change, the overall climate change discussion and the activities around surrounding climate change. Right. So right now there's a very broad definition. There's two terms that are used: climate denier, climate activist, right? And I think that's there's a narrow band. There's just two, right? Right now you hear climate activist, climate denier, and I think that's too narrow a band, and we need to expand it to 5 terms, right? So I want to talk about climate deniers, climate activists, and then I want to give 3 additional terms that I think we should begin using at the level of the media, at the level of the government, and at the level of commentators to accurately capture the different groupings of people that are associated with the climate change debate, right? And with the climate change activity around it. All right, so a good example of a climate activist, in my opinion, is clearly Jay Inslee, and I think he would call himself a climate champion, right? He is very active in fighting climate change, right? So saying that he's a climate activist, it to me seems very logical, right? So, and Jay Inslee is saying, hey, climate change should be a priority issue, right? And he's, of course, a 2020 U.S. Democrat primary presidential candidate, right? And he's saying, hey, this is important and we should really prioritize this. And he is active in fighting climate change, right? So I think Jay Inslee is a really good example of a climate activist. Now, climate activist is a term that is understood by the media, understood by commentators, understood by the general public, right? Now, what about climate deniers, right? Well, I think a good example of a climate denier is Jim Inhofe. He wrote an entire book saying concern over climate change is overinflated, and there are also liberal groups that have pointed at him, saying that logically he would fit in the climate denier category, right? So, like Beyond the Flood, they have a website for their movie, and they list James Inhofe as someone who has denied many of the claims that climate activists are claiming, right? So Jim Inhofe, he is a U.S. senator. I think he logically falls within the climate denier. In my opinion, he logically falls within the climate denier category. All right, so you have those specific categories, right? Now, I would like to add 3 more climate categories that we can start using, because I think the climate change debate, not the debate on whether climate change is real or is it affecting us, but what should be done about it, right? The only groups that is still debating that are the climate deniers, right? Which I think there aren't that many anymore, but I think Jim Inhofe definitely has, his book places him into that area, right? So you have that situation, right? And so who else is involved in the climate debate? Who is involved in activities around the climate change, right? Well, one of them is a climate moderate, right? Well, The Atlantic, which is, of course, a powerful media source, recently actually called out Carlos Corbello, right? And he was a congressperson who lost their seat, right? And they were calling out that he was a climate moderate, right? Someone who was willing to listen to people people who are like, hey, this is a crisis. We need to take really major steps right away at incredible cost, all the way to people saying, hey, we have more time than people are saying. Maybe we should try some long shot ideas rather than, and we can try moderate solutions rather than really radical solutions, right? So Carlos Corbello was identified by The Atlantic as a climate moderate, right? And I think that's a very real category, right? There are people who are like, I'm not really it's not fair to call me a climate activist, right? Now, all three of these, I will say right now, all three of these, I think you would be very, very hard. It would be very hard to find anybody who would self-identify as any of these, right? But I think they're very real, and I think they do exist, right? All right, so what's next? So what about, you have climate moderates. I think it's a very real group, and I think there's a significant number of people in there, and it is my opinion that the climate moderate group is significantly larger than the climate activist group, right? Then there's another group that I really think we need to identify and start using this term, which is the climate wearied, right? Now, who are the climate wearied, right? Well, George Marshall wrote a book called Don't Think About It. And in that book, he said that people are literally, their brains aren't wired to think about climate change crisis because it's so large and so daunting, right? And so it's frightening to them, right? So what I'm saying is that the climate wearied are people who are tired of hearing about it, and tired of there not being a solution, and tired of the debate, and tired of people who might only be a few degrees away from each other, but they're like, hey, this solution would be used and that solution would be used. So I think there's a really very distinct group who should be identified called the climate wearied. People who are just wearied by the whole situation. Wearied by the debate over it. Wearied also by a sense of ennui that they're like, maybe it's too late. Maybe we can't, fix the problem. So I think this idea of the climate wearied is very real and should really be acknowledged. Like, it's a very real group. The last group is climate technologists. It is my opinion that this is an emerging group. I am a member of this group, right? I am not a climate denier. I am not a climate activist. I am not a climate moderate, and I am not climate wearied. I'm not a climate wearied, right? I'm a climate technologist. These are a group of people who are saying, so right now, the vast majority of climate activists would say, okay, it's important to recycle. It's important to conserve. It's important to live a life that has a smaller carbon footprint, right? That's not me. I don't say any of those things. I believe that we can solve climate change specifically through technology. To me, the absolute best solution to climate change is colonization of Mars. Okay, so it would start with colonization of the moon, right? Because we would need that as a launching pad to get to Mars. And then we would colonize Mars and move half the people on planet Earth off onto Mars, right? Now, the reason why you would do that is you can have people living like kings, continuing to live like kings on the Earth. And since there are half of them there, the pollution would massively be reduced, right? And then I think that's a very real, logical solution, right? And I'm an American, right? Like, I just don't like the idea of telling people your life needs to be smaller, you need to be smaller, everything that's cool about you needs to shrink and go away, right? And it's just, I like American muscle cars, and I like cheeseburgers, these are, and to me, you're really not going to move forward telling people your life needs to suck more, in order to save the planet. Whereas if you're like, hey, let's colonize the moon, let's colonize Mars and move half the people off this planet, that is a very cool technology-based solution to climate change. And I think there are many other people who are climate technologists who are saying, yeah, I want the Earth's climate to improve, right? But, put iron into the oceans and create more CO2. Or let's capture the carbon that's being created and put it underground, right? And these are climate technologists. Now, I think it is very hard for climate technologists to self-identify, and one of the reasons why is when they do self-identify, people are like, this is a crisis, you really can't. If you take focus off of doing everything that's necessary of this really radical approach and smaller carbon footprints and less cool cars and eating plants, they can climate activists get really upset with anybody who's not down with that very uniform, very default solution, right? So I am a climate technologist. I think there are many others, right? And so it is my opinion that the narrow band that we currently use, climate activist, climate denier, and is too narrow, and we really need to broaden it to climate activists, climate denier, climate wearied, climate moderates, and climate technologists. I think that's an accurate view of the people who are actually involved in the climate debate and are involved in climate activities. All that is my opinion. I'd love to hear your opinion. Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.